Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the Nazi Holocaust, and this is not typically a conversation that we think about when we think about white-collar crime, but really the Nazi Holocaust is kind of this beautiful example of governmental deviance and really almost the perfection of governmental deviance against a group of individuals. So we're all familiar with the horrors of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Holocaust against Jewish people and gypsies and LGBTQ people and mentally ill people. Um, However, we typically look at it as a crime against humanity or as a form of genocide. We don't typically view it in the strictest sense through the lens of white collar crime. And so we're going to do that today. Now, before we even get started or talk about this for any length of time, it is important to note that it might seem like I'm diminishing what happened in the Holocaust because of this lens in which we're looking through it. And I don't want it to seem like that at all. My grandfather was, in fact, a survivor of the Holocaust. His entire family, his mother, father, brother, and sister were all killed during this horrific event. And so I don't want it to be viewed as me being disrespectful as much as we're viewing it through a different lens. And so the horrors are all still there. In no way is this a justification for the Holocaust. And if I'm talking about it and it seems insensitive, please know that that is not my heart and that is not where I'm coming from with this conversation. So the Holocaust could be viewed as this form of white-collar crime in that it was carried out in really small, seemingly innocuous ways. It wasn't like, Hitler stood up on stage and said, what we're going to do is gather all the Jewish people together, put them in camps, and exterminate them. Who's with me? And crowds just roared and said, yes, that sounds like a great idea. Let's do it. All of the steps to carry out the Holocaust were actually fairly small, fairly innocuous steps where no one individual was doing something from the initial arresting of the Jewish people all the way through to the genocide, right? They were just doing these small, kind of seemingly insignificant steps. All I'm doing is arresting the Jewish person. All I'm doing is confining them in the ghetto. All I'm doing is guarding the camp, right? And so they never felt like they were personally to blame, which is one way you actually accomplish something like this. The mechanism of destruction was really not that different from German society as a whole. And in fact, it wasn't like there was the special Holocaust office that oversaw these things. So, for example, the finance ministry was used to use the condemnation proceedings to set up Auschwitz, right? German railroads build the security police for transportation of the Jewish and other Holocaust inmates. Once the Jewish people or other people were removed from society, these unpaid bills had to be dealt with. People had to move into those homes. The jobs that went missing had to be filled. And so the normal German society as a whole is who kind of picked up these missing pieces, right? The German society in general, German people could move into these houses. The tax dollars helped pay and offset some of these bills. Orders were also carried out by word of mouth and along several different chains of command. So if, for example, a German railroad transported a whole train full of Jewish inmates to Auschwitz, they billed the government. The government doesn't really make money other than through taxation. So the government taxed people in order to pay those bills. So during this, anything like a genocide or the Holocaust or any other kind of world travesty, there's a three-step process to get something like this to work, right? There's the definition of the problem, the concentration or seizure of the problem, and then annihilating the problem. Specifically, the Nazis did this through a five-step process, but really, if you think about it, steps 2, 4, and 6 are just kind of sub-steps under this three-step process. And so even though it says, there's a three-step process for this to work, and now there's clearly 6 steps listed there, view the even-numbered steps there as kind of sub-steps to definition, concentration, and annihilation, right? So first one, definition. Who are the problems? We have to decide who the problem is. In this case, the problem are Jewish people, LGBTQ people, gypsies, mentally ill people, right? And so once we have established who this problem is, what do we do with the problem? Well, one thing to do is dismiss employees or expropriate businesses. We don't want Jewish individuals running this business, right? We don't want homosexual people working for us, so we're going to dismiss them or fire them. Then, once we have defined the problem, the next step here for any society to do this is concentrate the problem. And in this case, you exploit labor and use starvation measures to get what you want, right? And so my grandfather, for example, he was very routinely, not even loaned out because it's not like he got paid for it, but he was very routinely used as slave labor for farmers in the German countryside, or he worked in a radio shop where he was literally building radios for the German war effort. And because of these starvation measures, right, if you got the promise even of a little bit of extra food to do this work, you would do it in order to survive. And so these starvation measures helped bring about compliance, number one, because you could use food as kind of a reward, but number two, also, you didn't allow people to have the energy to kind of fight back against these brutal conditions. And then, of course, the final step is annihilation. And in this annihilation process, there's the confiscation of personal effects, like, you saw things confiscated from, of course, furniture and money and art, to even things like gold teeth were confiscated, and hair was shaved off and stuffed into mattresses to use for the submarines in World War II. So, in order to carry out the Holocaust effectively, right, it would not have worked to say, we are going to attack this type of people. That would not have been very effective, right? You have to attack ideals. And the reason you attack ideals as opposed to groups is because if you attack a group, people can always show you examples of that group that don't fit into that suggestion for that group, right? However, if you attack an ideal, you can then say, and who best represents that ideal? This group. So you're not attacking the group necessarily, you're attacking the ideal that this group allegedly stands for. And Jewish people were kind of the beginning of that attack. So why were Jewish people selected first? Well, first of all, Jewish people have the longest history of oppression and slavery in the world, right? Going back to biblical times, you see examples of Jewish people that are oppressed and enslaved all over the place, right? Also, especially at that time in society, Jewish people were typically viewed as the problem to most things. The Treaty of Versailles was pushed on the German people by these corrupt Jews. The Great Depression happened, and Jewish people tend to, as a group, or this is stereotypical, right? But as a group, Jewish people tend to be more financially conservative, and therefore they're not leveraging debt. They're not, living outside their means. So when economic depressions come, there's not as much. They're not as affected as a group as other segments of society, and therefore they're viewed as potentially causing, or because they're not as affected by these depressions, they're viewed as somehow doing something sketchy in order to not be affected by it. And especially given the historical context of the time, right? A harsh Treaty of Versailles, a Great Depression, and Jewish people seeming largely unaffected while the rest of German society is, starving in the streets. It was easy to kind of build up resentment against these ideals, and these Jewish people were clear examples of those ideals. Some examples of other groups that Nazis targeted included gypsies, Poles, asocials, which included the ugly, right, LGBTQ individuals. My grandfather had kind of the double whammy of being a Polish Jewish person, and so that did not, help him and his family in any sort of capacity. But as with all corporate deviance, right, roadblocks always pop up. These roadblocks could be administrative roadblocks by the government in the form of corporations, or in these governmental case, these roadblocks included things like procurement difficulties, shortages, mix-up, and other kind of general annoyances that governments have to deal with. Two particular were of note in the Holocaust, though: administrative problems and, more seriously, psychological problems. And we're going to spend some time talking about both of these. So, in terms of administrative problems, the Holocaust didn't produce anything, right? In fact, it destroyed things, quite literally destroyed human lives, over 6 million in total. And so because of that, it was a huge financial strain. Not only that, but if you think about it, there's limited money and manpower to make the efficiency of the Holocaust much more difficult to achieve. And so if you're fighting a war while also trying to exterminate a group of people, right, you need manpower to fight the war, but you also need manpower to guard the camps and to actually help carry out these executions. Also, most bureaucrats who dealt with Jewish problems were only focusing their attention on the Holocaust part-time, as there were other problems that arose in fighting a war and also trying to rebuild the German economy. So even in the camps, there were typically labor activities going on that needed to be supervised and efficient. As referenced, my grandfather was typically sold as slave labor. So you needed people to transport the inmates from the camps to where they were doing their slave labor and transport them back under security, right? You also needed people to still stay at the camp to provide security in the camp. And so this competition for resources became a challenge for those who were actually trying to effectively carry out the Holocaust. And it was actually to the great benefit of those who survived the Holocaust that the German government had their attention split between the war effort and this extermination effort. However, much more seriously were the psychological problems that arose as a result of the Holocaust, right? Administrative problems could be more easily solved because you could, hire more staff potentially, or try and recruit more manpower to those efforts. Psychological problems, though, are much more difficult to solve because the big fear is turning, the men into either neurotics or savages, and both would be a bad thing. You don't want, a nervous Nelly and someone who can't sleep at night and is thinking irrationally and really feeling guilty about what they're doing, working in these camps, because that would break down the efficiency of the camp. But at the same time, you don't want savages in the camps, and this seems kind of counterintuitive even, right? Why wouldn't you want a savage? But in order to rationalize that what you're doing is okay, there needs to be almost a clinical element to the executions and the concentration of the inmates in these camps, right? Because if people start being savages or being unduly cruel or being unduly unjust, right, even though the whole thing was, of course, unjust, but if they're too extreme in their unjust behavior, then it would turn the other people in the camp against the mission of the Holocaust, right? And so destruction had to be quick and excesses had to be avoided. If there was too much thought or attention being drawn to what was happening, it would cause a tremendous problem. So what were the ways that you combat this psychological threat, right? Well, there were a couple ways to do this. Number one, all seized property belonged to the Reich, right? So it's not like the soldiers were necessarily personally benefiting from this and therefore fighting over goods. While they were rewarded for their killings, all the property initially belonged to the Reich. And so therefore, everything you did was for this higher purpose, not to enrich yourself. Because if it was all to enrich yourself, it feels like stealing, and there's something inherently kind of icky about stealing, right? And of course, this is a huge irony, right? Because if they felt like they were stealing, maybe they wouldn't have gone through with the mass genocide of millions of people, right? Kind of ironic there. But still, that helped kind of rationalize what they were doing was for the greater good. Also, there was a prohibition of unauthorized killings. There was a clear line here between following orders and savagery. And so we don't want you to be a savage. You are a sophisticated man. You are doing a job. You are exterminating a threat. You're not being a brutal killer. This also separated the roles so that other Jewish people were responsible for the burning and burying of bodies, right? In all prisons, even today in American society, in prisons, the guards have one job and only one job, and that is to guard the prison. They're not cooking, they're not cleaning, they're not doing anything else in the prison other than guarding the prison. The same thing was true in the Holocaust, right? Each barrack was run by capos. The capos selected. If a guard said, hey, we need 10 people to go to the gas chamber from your barrack, the capo had to select who those 10 people were, not the guards. And so then they got let in, gassed, and then other inmates were the ones carrying the dead bodies out of the gas chambers and putting them in the crematoriums or burying them. And so in that way, all the German guards were doing was guarding the camp. They were not actually physically taking active part in the killings. So some other ways to help repress these problems where there was kind of five, not steps, but 5 ideas about how to best repress these psychological problems, right? Number one was shut off the supply of information from those who didn't have to know it. It would be bad for morale and bad for the public relations in general if, number one, the outside world knew about the Holocaust, because that would help rally and get other people into the war, or other countries into the war to try and help solve this genocide, but also the troops on the front lines are not going to fight hard for a country that's actively committing genocide. You can rationalize or justify that you're fighting for your country, you're fighting for the freedom of the German people, and that's different than I'm fighting so that German citizens can be murdered. Also, there was an effort to make sure anyone who knew also participated. That way, you can't, you can almost avoid the issue of whistleblowing if everyone was equally guilty and complicit in the killings, right? It kept people from claiming they were not involved or claiming they had some sort of moral objections to it. You had moral objections to these killings and yet you actively took part in it? That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Also, there's a prohibition of criticism, right? You were not allowed to actually criticize what was happening because if you did, it might start a wave of criticism for the whole process. Also, there was an elimination of the destruction process as a subject of social conversation. It was considered in poor taste. No one wants to know how the sausage is made. All that matters is German society is better, cleaner, and has a more pure bloodline because of the work we're doing. And also, there was an omission of the mention of killings in any sort of reports. And this is where you see some of these phrases that have become very commonplace in history about the Holocaust, right? It was not called the Holocaust when it was happening. It was called the final solution to the Jewish question. Jewish people were not concentrated and executed. They were evacuated. Sometimes even argued that they were evacuated for their own safety. So, of course, keeping the Holocaust quiet was not always possible. So the Nazis had to turn to other forms of rationalizations, right? If you lived in a neighborhood where your next door neighbor was Jewish and the SS or the Gestapo showed up at the door and your neighbors were missing, you had to come up with some sort of way to rationalize to the neighbors why your neighbors are not there anymore. So there was two major rationalizations that took place. One was justifications of the whole process, right? If Jewish people were in fact evil, killing Jewish people is killing evil. Isn't it a good thing to do to kill evil? Right? And so, there were arguments made, and these were, somewhat disingenuous arguments, but there were arguments made that, well, the way Adolf Hitler came to power was he was elected. He was always anti-Semitic. He always kind of in his speeches said, we need to stop this Jewish problem. So by electing him, you're kind of passively acknowledging that, in fact, you're wanting the Jewish people eliminated. There's also justifications like, should the Jewish people succeed, Germany would cease to exist. If you love your country, don't you want your country to be better? If we let the Jewish people win, Germany won't exist anymore. So fighting against Jewish people was fighting for your way of life. There were also these arguments about Jewish ritual murders, and there was a book actually called Jewish Ritual Murder, and it became quite popular, and it suggested that Jewish people murdered children all over Europe. So Jewish people were these monsters that were running around stealing your kids and killing them. So, do we really want to protect these people that are actively trying to murder our kids? Probably not, right? But that's justifications for the whole process. How do I justify when I'm watching a 7-year-old boy get led into a gas chamber? How can I justify that, right? That person is probably not committing a ritual murder. That person is probably not trying to overthrow the government. He's 7 years old, right? However, there were ways to do that also. Most people didn't work in camps and see the dead bodies, right? And so, it's argued that they killed people from behind the desk. They were just signing documents saying, all right, we're moving 10,000 more Jewish people from Yugoslavia to Auschwitz. Okay, sign the order, send them to Auschwitz. And so they were removed from the process. Also, even people at the camps had several justifications. They had superior orders. I'm just following orders. I was doing what my superiors told me to do like a good soldier. Also, some said they didn't act out of personal vindictiveness. Listen, I did my best to treat them as human as possible right up until the end. I had no personal animus against them. I just, I was doing what was told of me in a humane way. Others also argue that the actions were not criminal, that the next guys are. Listen, all I did was put them in the room, right? Or I supervised them getting marched into the gas chambers. I wasn't the one who dropped the gas. Listen, all I was doing was standing on the roof dropping gas, and I had no idea if there was one person in there or 50 people in there. All my job was to drop gas in. And so everyone else was responsible for the actual killings, not yourself individually. Also, the argument of it's not just me. I'm replaceable, and I couldn't possibly do this alone. I was just a cog in this large machine, right? I was just one small tooth in this large machine of the Holocaust that was working its way through Europe at the time. And so all of these are kind of administrative ways that the Holocaust took place. And you can kind of see how similar this is to corporations, right? So a lot of these ideas, right? Like people are replaceable. I am replaceable. I'm just a cog in the machine, right? Positions as building blocks. I'm just doing what my position is supposed to do. All of these are ways that people were able to rationalize the Holocaust, much like they rationalize any other form of business deviance. This was just a government doing it as opposed to a corporation. So that is one kind of example of this governmental deviance that was done very, very poorly, and the aftermath really of it was kind of weak at best. If you think about it right now, if you think about the Holocaust in today's society, we say, well, the Nazis were bad people that went out and did these bad things. The reality is, the entire country of Germany knew what was going on. Jewish people were going missing. Camps were being set up in places where people live. People, like my grandfather was getting sold as slave labor to private corporations and farmers in Germany. So everyone knew what was happening, but the government as a whole didn't really ever take full responsibility for what happened. Compare that to apartheid in South Africa and apartheid torture. And this was a form of governmental deviance that was handled in a much better way. And in fact, people have even argued that if America handled slavery like South Africa handled apartheid, that racial divisions and racial divides in America would be significantly smaller. So what did South Africa do? Well, let's look at the example of Jeffrey Benzien. And there's Jeffrey Benzien right there sitting on top of presumably a inmate doing wet bag torture is what this was called. But Jeff Benzien was a police officer in South Africa. And he was responsible for extracting confessions from black people during apartheid in South Africa. He routinely used things like wet bag torture, which is very, very similar to waterboarding, where you stick a wet bag over someone's face to simulate the idea that they're drowning. He would attach electrodes to people's bodies and shock them. He would sometimes sodomize them with a broomstick. And when apartheid happened, South Africa, when apartheid ended, I should say, and South Africa became, it basically allowed for racial equality in South Africa, there was these Truth and Reconciliation committees or commissions where people could apply for amnesty if they did these terrible things during apartheid. And Mr. Benzien was one of these people who applied for amnesty. He suggested that he was following explicit or implicit orders to spy on and obtain information from the African National Congress Party. And so he said whether the orders were explicit or not, what my superiors wanted was information. And I got information even if I had to use torture methods to get that information. He did so in any way he saw fit and under the watchful eye of his supervisors, who said it was totally fine for him to do what he did. After extensive psychiatric help, it became clear that Mr. Benzien was suffering from the harm he caused others, and his psychiatrist even presented to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, like, look, he did all of these things. He's acknowledging that he did all these things. What he's doing is asking for forgiveness because he was part of this oppressive governmental system that was oppressing black Africans during this apartheid era. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission cleared him, and this was under the leadership of Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela basically said, what we need is for people to come, acknowledge what they've done to us black Africans in South Africa during these times, and then we need to have these forgiveness rituals, and we need to do these things where we both move past this and acknowledge how messed up this past was, but then agree that we're going to, as a unit, move on from it. Let's talk it all out. Let's present evidence of what you did. Let's see how genuinely remorseful you are, and move past it together as a group. And South Africa is a really good example of where this has worked effectively. And so apartheid is a form of governmental deviance, obviously, as well, that was handled a lot better and has brought about, as its end. Its end was handled a lot better, and the current state and future of South Africa is significantly brighter than in a lot of places where there was slavery and racial tension because of these Truth and Reconciliation Committees. So, as always, if you have any questions, just drop a comment down below and I will respond to you as soon as possible.